Really?
Yep.
Okay, good. Give a big applause, Peter Joseph. Go ahead.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Everything good? Okay. So we're running quite behind, but luckily we have this space for quite a period. It kind of just bleeds into the evening, so I'm glad you all remained, and we'll hopefully continue to remain. In fact, I think everyone's still here. What a great looking crowd. All right. So I did a series called Origins and Adaptations, 2012, 2014 respectively. Supposed to end there, but I decided to continue. This dealt historically with the capitalist economy, and I wanted to show how the system worked, where it came from, how it's evolved, and a lot of things I think everybody here must be very, very aware of by now. We should all be well aware that most everything we are experiencing in the world today, from ecological decline to endless government business corruption to human exploitation to perpetual poverty to constant war to growing unemployment to debt collapse and to the overall value system disorder, has been predictable. Predictable when viewing the state of the world through the prism of current economic functionality. And from this system-based worldview, we can not only better understand the past and the present, we can also anticipate, of course, what is in store for the future as this social cancer continues to morph and grow and mutate and absorb and in effect decouple humanity from everything most fundamental to our long-term social and ecological sustainability. So before I close this subject, which has been drilled in at length, I want to re-summarize the issue with a quote by a man named Gary Halfus. Our economic, social life, politics, and schools have insisted that having more toys is better than having fewer toys, that buying stuff is good for us, that we have to keep up with or exceed others in our consumption, that a high-paying job can take the place of meaningful work, that low-paying, meaningless jobs that demean our humanity are better than none, and we should be grateful for them because they will turn us into decent citizens, and that a free market has the same powers as a just God. But capitalism rests ultimately not on innovation or entrepreneurship or brains or even a free market. Those are just stories. Stories we like to tell ourselves because they make those who are successful look good. At its base, industrial capitalism's success rests on exploitation of resources, racism, child abuse, sexism, and war. But even more than all these, contemporary capitalism rests on consumption. Government and corporate consumption of resources, technology and scientific research, and citizen consumption of market goods. We are asked to consume not only material goods, but ideas, policies, whole world views that are presented with all the persuasive skills and battering psychological hype that can be bought. We are under assault. We are laid siege by hype, corporate hype, political hype, military hype, educational hype, commercial hype, and as our civil rights have declined in recent years, freedom has come to mean the freedom to choose among 16 brand names of one product. This is the harvest of a culture so bent on growth with all possible speed that it will pour 100,000 chemicals in the earth and atmosphere into our lakes and groundwater and oceans before it has a clue about the long-term effects of a single one of them. Now, that out of the way, what I'd like to do here, take the terms origins, adaptations, change the context a bit. Instead of how the current economic system has evolved, let's look at the other side and inside. What is the technical history, for example, of this logic we might term a natural law resource-based economy? And more importantly, what is its relationship to the evolution of material culture? This term abundance we often flagrantly toss out. What does this evolution suggest about ourselves, our psychology, our sociology, even our nature, as the deeply social organisms we are? Now, I have to warn you, this presentation is a bit stream of consciousness. I'm less interested in defining a whole set of ideas and drilling it throwing it down your throat. And I want you to more or less entertain the concepts I put forward, even though naturally I may be drawing some conclusions. Here is a table of contents. If you could read it in the back, I'm sorry. If you can't read it, I'm sorry. By a man named John Eltzler. Some of the themes might sound eerily familiar if you read these contents. We have chapters on the power of wind, tide, waves. We have chapters on systems of machineries and the establishment of applications of these powers. A plan for building of a community. Oh, and the earth can nourish 1,000 times more men than now exist, etc. Sounds familiar. This is one of the first post-scarcity books ever written. The subjects include the importance of renewable energy in a systems approach, applying machines to labor, of course, adapting human values through education, and creating an abundance. Here are some quotes. The first elements of mechanics teach that there is no motion imaginable that cannot be produced by some adapted mechanism, provided we have the requisite power. We have superabundance of power, 1,000,000 times greater than all men on earth could effect hitherto. The powers are chiefly to be derived from the wind, from the tide, from sunshine, and the heat of the sun. Each of these powers requires no consumption of materials, only materials for the construction of the machineries. Once established, there will be no occasion for any work except the superintendence of machinery, which requires 1 to 3 persons in all, these being relative, of the whole community. If done in turns, every adult would hardly have 1 turn for 1 day's superintendence in the whole year. But it would probably be done voluntarily, being about an amusement, no tedious occupation of labor. Today, we drudge and toil in agriculture and in manufacturers, making many useful and many useless things for human life, for supplying many various demands and necessities, comforts, and luxuries. We care little about the real benefit our industry may afford to the buyer, provided we make money by their sale. There is an endless variety of artificial productions of every kind resulting from competition of the producers. What virtue can be in passing one's life like a prisoner in a treadmill? The occupations of manner or present state of advancement are yet not much better. They are either a monotonous drudgery or some insipid occupation, but which nothing but custom and necessity may render tolerable in some degree, but which are the very means to keep the mind in inactivity and low, trivial pursuits. What might the mighty object of leading such a life? What is the mighty object of leading such a life? Of course, to get money in order to buy what one wants. Is this the most exalted virtue, the highest destination of man's life that can be thought of in this world? It may be a virtue or an evil or a necessary evil in a state of general ignorance and prejudice, but it is no virtue found in nature. Any of this sound familiar? This book is called The Paradise Within the Reach of All Men Without Labor by the Powers of Nature and Machinery, and it was written almost 200 years ago in 1833. About 50 years before the first light bulb was invented. Etzler envisioned a society that harnessed renewable energies in various ways, plugging it into power steam engines, and using those engines in turn to facilitate automation, stopping human servitude and drudgery, and hence the creation of his view of global abundance. He even talks about creating composite materials out of wood dust and particles, and approaching architecture through molding and extrusion, along with mixed-use concepts such as ocean-powered steam vessels that are desalinating water at the same time as producing energy. And of course, he implies little need for the market or monetary system and saw it as a waste of life and inefficiency. It's safe to say that historically speaking, Etzler appears to be one of the first to promote the most core framework of what PZM generally embraces. His primitive but lucid analysis regarding the potential of science and technology to help humanity through earth-based natural law design is really missing nothing when you read his work. His overall technical perspective is sound. And of course, it didn't take long for Etzler to be derisively labeled as the first technological utopianist, a term that has persisted ever since, as I'm sure many here have heard. And to this, he jauntily added, "But there will be men who are so ill-favored by nature they slovenly adhere to their accustomed narrow notions without inquiring into the truth of new ideas, and will rather, in apology for their mental sloth, pride themselves in despising, disputing, and ridiculing whatever appeals novel to them." Again, sound familiar? Now, I will admit, to his discredit, if you read it, he's a bit gratuitous. He does go overboard with his vision of this so-called paradise, and it's often difficult to read through his work without getting an over-exaggerated sense, an unrealistic sense due to his rhetoric. which I think is common with a lot of people, a lot of futurists throughout history. And he also, sadly enough, did fail in his lifetime to produce the engineering that he sought, and mainstream history pretty much sees him as delusional, as a delusional mad scientist. Now, all that noted, a historical little tidbit. Let's do a thought experiment. Let's assume we went back to 1833, the time of this book, but instead of using Etzler's primitive version of what could be a resource-based economy, with renewable energy-powered steam engines moving steel and wood automation machines to free labor, we instead transplanted the current, common 21st century technology into 19th century. Remember, Etzler's idea of paradise was to remove the need for labor drudgery and create abundance in the material climate he knew at the time. Keep that in mind. Back then, there were no powered cars, no home-wired electricity, no planes. We hadn't even hit the Victorian era yet. Life was very simple in comparison to today. And just as we today have little clue what material life will be like 200 years from now, how could we expect Etzler to perceive any differently? Again, his vision of paradise was based upon the expectations, values, and ambitions of the time. It's a very important point. Back to the issue. It is needless to say that there's certainly no question that 21st century technology as we know it could create the material expectations of an upper class lifestyle, standard of living, respective to the early to mid 19th century without labor for income, assuming a shift in the social system, of course. Absolutely no question. And again, before I go further, please understand that this is an argumentative abstraction. This is speculation. As if we're aliens that came down in 1833 to install automated tech, filling in whatever industry was doing at the time, the means of production and interest, to satisfy the interests of the time. So I don't want anyone to read into this to think that this is a static state of concept of technology, because really, in truth, when technology develops, it changes our values. So keep that in mind. This is about a material expectation of a given culture at a given time.